November 15, 1944, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. In a small infirmary at the edge of a prisoner of war compound, a 23-year-old German woman named Gisela Hartmann sat trembling on an examination table, her eyes fixed on a small glass bottle filled with what she was certain was human blood. The liquid inside gleamed bright crimson under the harsh overhead lights, and the label meant nothing to her limited English. All she understood was that an American nurse was approaching her with that bottle, intending to put its contents on her skin. This wasn't supposed to happen. When Gisela had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps 2 years earlier in Berlin, they had told her that if she was ever captured, she should expect interrogation, perhaps imprisonment. But nothing like this, nothing that involved mysterious red liquids and medical procedures she couldn't understand. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and she found herself thinking of her mother back in Berlin, wondering if she would ever see her again. Lieutenant Opal Pritchard, the camp's medical officer from Arkansas, had seen fear in prisoners' eyes before, but this was different. This young German woman looked absolutely terrified, and all Opal was trying to do was treat a simple cut on her arm. The wound wasn't serious, just a scrape from the barbed wire fence during the transport to the compound, but it needed cleaning and antiseptic to prevent infection. She held up the bottle of Mercurochrome, the standard red antiseptic used in every American medical facility, and tried to explain in simple English what she was about to do. But Gisela didn't hear explanation. She heard threatening words in a foreign language, while a woman in an enemy uniform held what looked like a bottle of blood. Everything the Reich had told her about American brutality seemed to be coming true in this moment. She had heard whispers among the other prisoners during the long journey across the Atlantic, rumors about what Americans did to capture German soldiers, stories that grew more horrific with each retelling. And now here was the proof, gleaming red in a small glass bottle. What Gisela couldn't know in that moment of terror was that this misunderstanding would become the turning point, not just for her, but for nearly 40 German women prisoners at Camp Shelby. That small bottle of Mercurochrome, with its alarming crimson color and unfamiliar name, would become a symbol of everything these women had been taught to believe about their enemies, and everything they would learn was false. But on this November afternoon, as the Mississippi sun cast long shadows across the infirmary floor, all Gisela knew was fear. Fear of the red bottle, fear of the American nurse, and fear of what would happen when that mysterious liquid touched her skin. She pulled her arm away and whispered the only English word she knew with certainty. No, please, no. 3 days earlier, on November 12, 1944, a military transport truck had rolled through the gates of Camp Shelby carrying 42 German women who had never expected to see American soil. They sat in 2 rows facing each other, their gray auxiliary uniforms wrinkled and stained from weeks of travel. Most kept their eyes downcast, but a few stared out through the canvas opening at the unfamiliar landscape of southern Mississippi. Gisela Hartmann had been one of those who looked outside, trying to understand where fate had brought her. The pine trees were different from the forests around Berlin, taller and straighter, and the air felt thick and warm, despite it being November. She clutched a small leather satchel that contained everything she still owned in the world: a photograph of her family, a comb, and a letter from her brother written 6 months before she lost contact with him. Beside her sat Margaret Vogel, whom everyone called Greta. At 22, she had worked as a medical assistant in Hamburg before the war had consumed everything. Her hands, trained to steady instruments and comfort patients, now trembled slightly as the truck came to a stop. She had seen wounded soldiers during her service, had witnessed suffering that still haunted her dreams, but nothing had prepared her for the uncertainty of being a prisoner in enemy territory. Waltraud Fischer, called Trudy by those who knew her well, sat near the back of the truck. At 25, she was one of the older women in the group, a former secretary from Frankfurt who had been captured along with her entire administrative unit when Allied forces overran their position in France. She maintained a rigid posture, her face carefully neutral, determined not to show the Americans any weakness or fear. The youngest among them was Brunhilde Lehmann, barely 20 years old, who had served as a translator due to her aptitude for languages. Bruni had studied English in school and could understand more of what the American guards were saying than the others, though she kept this knowledge largely to herself. What she heard didn't comfort her. The guards spoke of them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, calling them Nazi girls and wondering aloud what women were doing in uniform anyway. Lieutenant Opal Pritchard watched from the administrative building as the women were unloaded from the truck. She had been given just 2 days' notice that her facility would be receiving female prisoners, a rarity in the American POW system. Most camps held only men, but someone in Washington had decided that women prisoners required separate facilities. Opal had spent those 2 days preparing the barracks, arranging for additional female guards, and trying to imagine what it would be like to oversee women who had served the enemy. Corporal Maxine Dubois, whom everyone called Max, stood beside her. The Louisiana native had volunteered for this assignment out of curiosity more than anything else. Now, watching the German women form uncertain lines in the compound yard, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. The women who arrived at Camp Shelby were not the hardened soldiers that American propaganda had taught citizens to expect. They were typists and radio operators, nurses and supply clerks, women who had joined the auxiliary services believing they were supporting their country's defense. Most came from middle-class families in cities across Germany, daughters of teachers and shopkeepers, factory workers, and civil servants. Gisela Hartmann had been working as a radio operator when the Allies captured her unit outside of Lyon. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, motivated less by political ideology than by the simple fact that young women were expected to serve. Her father, a postal worker in Berlin, had been quietly skeptical of the Reich's grand promises, but he had never spoken his doubts aloud. Gisela had inherited his caution, performing her duties efficiently while keeping her personal thoughts carefully guarded. Greta Vogel's path to military service had been different. She had genuinely wanted to help, inspired by a desire to heal and care for the wounded. Her work as a medical assistant in Hamburg had given her skills that the military desperately needed, and she had been assigned to a field hospital unit that moved with German forces across France. She had seen the costs of war up close, had held the hands of dying soldiers, both German and Allied, and had developed a profound weariness with all of it. Trudy Fisher had been conscripted rather than volunteering. As a secretary with excellent organizational skills, she had been deemed essential to military administration and given little choice about her assignment. She had spent the war managing supply records and personnel files, work that felt disconnected from the actual fighting until the day Allied forces arrived at her office and she found herself facing American soldiers with rifles. Bruni Lehmann had joined because of her languages. At 20, fluent in both English and French, as well as her native German, she had been valuable to military intelligence. She had translated intercepted communications, helped interrogate prisoners, and gradually come to understand that the war was not going the way German propaganda claimed. By the time of her capture, she had already begun to doubt everything she had been told about the Reich's inevitable victory. Now these women stood in formation in the Mississippi heat, listening to Lieutenant Pritchard explain the camp rules through an interpreter. They would be housed in barracks separate from any male prisoners. They would be assigned work duties. They would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They would be allowed to write letters home, though those letters would be censored. They would remain here until the war ended, and arrangements could be made for their repatriation. What Lieutenant Pritchard didn't tell them, because she didn't yet know it herself, was that some of them would never want to go home. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and confusion. The German women moved through their days like sleepwalkers, following orders they barely understood, eating unfamiliar food and trying to make sense of their new reality. The American guards watched them warily, uncertain how to interact with female enemy prisoners. An uneasy truce developed, marked by careful distance and minimal communication. Gisela spent most of her time trying to remain invisible. She performed her assigned cleaning duties without complaint, kept her eyes down during meals, and spoke only to the other German women in whispered conversations after lights out. She was determined to survive this imprisonment without drawing attention to herself, to simply endure until she could return to whatever remained of her life in Berlin. But on November 15th, that plan fell apart. She had been assigned to help repair a section of fence that separated the women's compound from the administrative area. The work was simple enough, holding posts steady, while others secured the barbed wire. But the wire was old and rusty, and when one section snapped free, it caught her forearm before she could pull away. The cut wasn't deep, but it was long and immediately began to bleed. Private Geneva Walsh, the guard supervising the work detail, saw it happen and reacted quickly. She called for Gisela to come with her to the infirmary, gesturing at the wound and then toward the medical building. Gisela understood the gesture, if not the words, and she followed, pressing her other hand against the cut to slow the bleeding. The infirmary was a small wooden building that smelled of antiseptic and something else Gisela couldn't identify. Lieutenant Pritchard was inside, reviewing medical records at her desk. She looked up when Geneva brought Gisela in, assessed the situation immediately, and directed the young German woman to sit on the examination table. Opal Pritchard had treated hundreds of wounds during her years as a nurse, from minor scrapes to life-threatening injuries. This cut required nothing more than cleaning, antiseptic, and a bandage. She gathered her supplies efficiently, filling a basin with water, retrieving clean gauze, and reaching for the bottle of Mercurochrome that sat on the supply shelf. The moment Gisela saw the red liquid, her entire body went rigid. Her limited English had picked up some words during the week, but Mercurochrome meant nothing to her. What she saw was a bottle filled with something that looked exactly like blood, dark crimson and thick. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was this some kind of test, a punishment, an experiment? Lieutenant Pritchard noticed the change immediately. The young woman had gone pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. Opal tried to explain, speaking slowly and clearly, medicine, antiseptic, help, healing. But the words just seemed to increase Gisela's panic. That evening, the women's barracks filled with urgent whispered conversations in German. Gisela sat on her bunk, her bandaged arm resting in her lap, while the others gathered around to hear what had happened in the infirmary. She described the bottle, the red liquid, the American nurse's insistence on applying it to her skin. Her voice shook as she recounted how terrified she had been, how certain that something terrible was about to happen. Greta Vogel listened with particular intensity. As someone with medical training, she tried to think of what the red liquid might actually be, but her experience had been with German medical supplies. She had never seen anything quite like what Gisela described. The color troubled her most. Why would any legitimate medicine be that dark shade of red? It looked too much like blood, and that couldn't be coincidental. Trudy Fisher's reaction was immediate and cynical. Of course, the Americans would use psychological tactics, she said. They wanted the prisoners to be afraid, to be compliant. The mysterious red bottle was probably just the beginning. She reminded the others of stories they had all heard during their service, propaganda about American cruelty and barbarism. Perhaps those stories hadn't been propaganda after all, but Bruni Lehman had caught something the others had missed. She had been close enough to the infirmary earlier that day to hear some of the conversation between Lieutenant Pritchard and Private Walsh. The American nurse had seemed genuinely confused by Gisela's reaction, not cruel or threatening. Bruni mentioned this quietly, but her observation was drowned out by the rising tide of fear and speculation. Within hours, the story had spread through the entire compound. Each retelling added new details, new interpretations, new reasons for fear. Some women claimed they had seen other prisoners taken to the infirmary and returning with strange red stains on their skin. Others insisted they had heard screams coming from the medical building, though no one could say exactly when. The red bottle became a symbol of everything unknown and threatening about their captivity. By the next morning, 3 women had developed mysterious ailments that they insisted didn't require medical attention. A fever that wasn't quite high enough to be concerning. A persistent cough that seemed worse when guards were nearby, but improved when they left. A twisted ankle that the woman could still walk on, just not very well. Lieutenant Pritchard recognized the pattern immediately. They were afraid of the infirmary. Corporal Max Dubois found the situation both frustrating and oddly touching. These women were so terrified of a simple antiseptic that they would rather suffer than seek treatment. She tried to explain to Lieutenant Pritchard that Mercurochrome's color was probably the problem, that to someone unfamiliar with American medical supplies, it might look alarming, but Opal was already dealing with a more immediate concern. One of the prisoners had developed what looked like the early stages of bronchitis, and she was refusing to come to the infirmary for examination. The standoff had begun. The German women whispered about the red bottle and avoided medical care. The American staff grew increasingly concerned about untreated illnesses spreading through the compound. And in the middle of it all, a simple bottle of antiseptic sat on a shelf, its crimson contents becoming more mysterious and threatening with each passing day. Corporal Maxine Dubois had grown up in a small town outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the daughter of a Creole seamstress and a French-speaking fisherman. She had learned early in life that misunderstandings between different groups of people were usually based on fear of the unfamiliar, and that patience and clear communication could solve most problems. But this situation with the German women and the red bottle was testing even her considerable reserves of both qualities. Max had volunteered for service as a military nurse after Pearl Harbor, driven by a desire to contribute to the war effort and escape the limited opportunities available to young women in her hometown. She had expected to be sent overseas, perhaps to field hospitals in Europe or the Pacific. Instead, she had been assigned to Camp Shelby, treating everything from training injuries to the occasional illness among the guards and administrative staff. The arrival of female German prisoners had been the most interesting thing to happen in months. She found herself fascinated by the women, particularly by the obvious intelligence and education many of them possessed. Gisella's careful, watchful demeanor reminded Max of her own younger sister, always observing before acting. Greta's medical knowledge, even limited by language barriers, was evident in how she assessed other prisoners' minor complaints. Trudy carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and organization. And young Bruni's occasional flashes of English comprehension suggested she understood far more than she let on. But the red bottle incident had created a wall of mistrust that Max desperately wanted to break through. She had tried speaking to the women in simple English, using gestures and facial expressions to convey that the Mercurochrome was meant to help, not harm. She had even brought medical textbooks to show them, pointing at illustrations and chemical formulas, though she suspected the technical information meant little to them. Lieutenant Pritchard had a different approach. Opal believed in maintaining professional distance from prisoners, treating them with correct medical care, but not becoming personally involved. She had seen too many guards and staff members at other facilities become emotionally compromised by relationships with prisoners, and she was determined not to let that happen at her infirmary. The philosophical difference between the two women came to a head when the prisoner with bronchitis, a 30-year-old woman named Else Reinhardt, collapsed during morning roll call. She had been hiding the severity of her illness for nearly a week, and now her condition had deteriorated to the point where she couldn't stand without assistance. Max and Opal carried Elsa to the infirmary, laying her on the examination table where Gisela had sat just days before. The woman's breathing was labored and her fever dangerously high. She needed immediate treatment, including the application of antiseptic to a secondary infection that had developed from a minor scratch she had also been hiding. Lieutenant Pritchard reached for the Mercurochrome, but before she could open the bottle, Elsa's eyes widened in terror, and she tried to roll off the table, too weak to actually escape but desperate to try. Max made a decision in that moment that would change everything. Corporal Du Bois held up her hand, stopping Lieutenant Pritchard before she could apply the Mercurochrome to the terrified prisoner. Max had an idea, though she wasn't certain it would work. She needed to show these women that the red bottle wasn't a threat, but simply telling them wouldn't be enough. They needed to see proof they could understand, evidence that transcended the language barrier. She asked Lieutenant Pritchard to wait, then left the infirmary and walked quickly to the women's barracks. Using gestures and the few German words she had picked up, she indicated that she wanted several of the prisoners to come with her. Gisela, Greta, Trudy, and Bruni exchanged uncertain glances, but followed. They had heard about Elsa's collapse and feared the worst. When they entered the infirmary and saw Elsa on the examination table, pale and struggling to breathe, their immediate instinct was to help their fellow prisoner. But they froze when they saw Lieutenant Pritchard holding the red bottle. Max positioned herself between the German women and Opal, then did something that made the lieutenant's eyes widen in surprise. She took the Mercurochrome bottle from Opal's hands, opened it carefully, and tilted it so the watching prisoners could see the liquid inside. Then, maintaining eye contact with Gisela, she deliberately poured a small amount onto her own palm. The red liquid pooled in her hand, bright and alarming against her brown skin. The German women gasped, certain they were about to witness something horrible. But Max simply spread the Mercurochrome across her palm and the back of her hand, showing them how it left a red-orange stain on her skin, but caused no pain, no burning, no injury. She held her hand up for them to see, turning it slowly so they could examine it from all angles. Greta stepped forward first, her medical training overcoming her fear. She looked closely at Max's hand, even daring to touch it gently to feel if the skin was damaged. She found nothing but the harmless stain of antiseptic. Her expression changed from fear to confusion to understanding. This wasn't blood, this wasn't a weapon, this was medicine, just strange-looking medicine she had never encountered before. Bruni, watching this interaction, suddenly remembered a word from her English studies. Antiseptic, she said quietly. For wounds, clean. The other German women looked at her, and she repeated it in German, explaining what she thought the red liquid actually was. A disinfectant like iodine, just a different color and formulation. The tension in the room shifted. It didn't disappear entirely. Generations of propaganda and weeks of fear couldn't evaporate in a single moment, but it changed. The German women were no longer looking at the bottle with absolute terror. They were looking at it with cautious curiosity. Lieutenant Pritchard, recovering from her surprise at Max's unauthorized demonstration, took advantage of the moment. She approached Elsa, who was now watching with less panic, and gestured to the woman's infected scratch. She showed Elsa the Mercurochrome bottle, then pointed to Max's unstained hand, making it clear that the medicine was temporary and harmless. December brought cold rain to Mississippi and a deepening crisis in the women's compound. Despite Max's demonstration with the Mercurochrome, trust remained fragile. Some prisoners had begun accepting basic medical care, but others still refused treatment for anything beyond the most serious conditions. The winter weather, combined with inadequate heating in the barracks, created a breeding ground for respiratory infections that spread quickly through the confined quarters. By mid-December, nearly half the women were sick with varying degrees of illness. Most cases were minor, persistent colds and coughs that would resolve with rest and basic care. But several women had developed more serious conditions that Lieutenant Pritchard knew could become dangerous without proper treatment. The problem was that the sickest prisoners were often those most resistant to accepting help. Gisela had become an unexpected bridge between the two groups. After witnessing Max's demonstration and seeing that the Mercurochrome truly was harmless medicine, she had begun translating for other prisoners during medical visits. Her careful nature made her credible to the German women, while her growing willingness to work with the Americans made her valuable to the staff. She found herself in an uncomfortable middle position, trusted by neither side completely, but needed by both. The situation reached its breaking point 10 days before Christmas, when Trudy Fisher collapsed during evening meal. The 35-year-old had been fighting pneumonia for more than a week, hiding the severity of her condition out of stubborn pride and lingering distrust of American medical care. She had convinced herself that she could recover through willpower alone, that accepting help from the enemy was a form of weakness or betrayal. When she fell, her breathing was so labored that even the most skeptical prisoners recognized the emergency. Greta and Bruni carried her to the infirmary, while someone ran to fetch Lieutenant Pritchard, who had already left for the day. Max arrived within minutes, took one look at Trudy's gray pallor and struggling respirations, and knew this was beyond the scope of basic camp medical care. She sent Private Walsh to telephone for the camp doctor, a civilian physician from nearby Hattiesburg, who served as consultant for serious cases. Dr. Bernard Feldman arrived an hour later, examined Trudy, and confirmed Max's assessment. Severe pneumonia, possibly complicated by pleurisy. The woman needed hospitalization, aggressive antibiotic treatment, and round-the-clock nursing care that the small camp infirmary couldn't provide. But there was a problem. The nearest hospital willing to treat enemy prisoners was in Jackson, more than 60 miles away. The roads were poor, made worse by recent rain, and Trudy was too unstable for a long transport. Dr. Feldman made the decision to treat her at the camp, converting one corner of the infirmary into a makeshift hospital room. He would return twice daily to monitor her condition, but the bulk of the nursing care would fall to Lieutenant Pritchard and Corporal Dubois. And that care would require extensive use of Mercurochrome and other medications that still frightened many of the German prisoners. Trudy's survival would depend not just on medical treatment, but on whether her fellow prisoners could overcome their remaining fears enough to let the Americans help. Trudy Fisher lay in the infirmary bed fighting for each breath, her fever spiking dangerously high despite the ice baths and medications. Lieutenant Pritchard had moved a cot into the infirmary to monitor her patient through the night, while Max took shifts during the day. The two nurses worked with quiet efficiency, but both knew they were in a race against time and infection. The German women responded to Trudy's crisis in ways that surprised the American staff. They organized themselves into a rotation of visitors, 2 at a time, sitting quietly beside her bed and speaking soft words of encouragement in German. They brought small comforts from the barracks, a worn photograph of Trudy's family, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, a book of poetry she had carried from Frankfurt. Greta proved invaluable during this period. Her medical training allowed her to assist Lieutenant Pritchard in ways that transcended language barriers. She understood vital signs, recognized the symptoms of complications before they became critical, and could anticipate what supplies would be needed. Opal found herself working alongside the German woman with an ease that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The crisis also brought Bruni's language skills fully into the open. She stopped pretending her English was limited and began translating medical explanations and instructions with careful precision. Her ability to communicate between the nurses and the sick woman made treatment far more effective. Trudy could understand what was happening to her body and why certain procedures were necessary. On the third night of Trudy's illness, her fever reached 105 degrees. Dr. Feldman had warned that if they couldn't break the fever soon, brain damage or death became increasingly likely. Lieutenant Pritchard prepared an alcohol bath while Max gathered ice from the mess hall. They needed to cool Trudy's body temperature quickly, and the treatment would be uncomfortable and frightening. Gisela sat beside the bed, holding Trudy's hand and explaining what the nurses were about to do. The sick woman, delirious with fever, kept repeating the same phrase in German, "Not the red bottle, not the blood." Bruni translated, and Max felt her heart break a little. Even in her delirium, Trudy was still afraid of the Mercurochrome. Max made a decision then. She asked Bruni to explain to Trudy exactly what Mercurochrome was, where it came from, why it was red, how it worked. Bruni translated the information carefully, adding her own reassurances based on what she had learned. The red color came from mercury and bromine compounds. It had been used in American medicine for decades. It prevented infection by killing bacteria. Trudy's fevered eyes focused briefly on Max's face. The corporal was holding a cloth soaked in the antiseptic, ready to clean a new wound on Trudy's arm, where an injection site had become irritated. In that moment, through the fog of illness, Trudy had to make a choice. Trust or resist, accept help or cling to fear. She closed her eyes and nodded slightly. Max applied the Mercurochrome gently while Greta held Trudy's other hand. The red stain spread across pale skin, marking the moment when fear began its final retreat. The morning after Trudy's fever broke, something shifted in the compound. Word had spread among the German prisoners that their fellow inmate had survived the crisis, and that her survival had required accepting the mysterious red medicine they had all feared. The women began asking questions through Bruni and Gisela, wanting to understand what Mercurochrome actually was, and why Americans used something that looked so alarming. Lieutenant Pritchard recognized an opportunity. She had been thinking about Max's impromptu demonstration weeks earlier and realized that a more structured educational approach might help dispel the remaining fears. She proposed to Sergeant Floyd Ramsey, the camp's administrative officer, that they organize a basic medical education session for the prisoners. He was skeptical at first, concerned about fraternization and security, but eventually agreed to a supervised gathering. The session was scheduled for December 20th in the mess hall. Attendance was voluntary, but nearly 30 of the 42 women showed up, driven by curiosity and the example of Trudy's recovery. Lieutenant Pritchard had prepared carefully, gathering various medical supplies and arranging for Bruni to provide translation. She began with the basics. She showed them standard bandages, explaining their purpose and demonstrating their use. She displayed bottles of aspirin, describing how they reduced fever and pain. She presented iodine, another antiseptic, and let them see how it stained skin a different color. Each item was passed around the room so the women could examine it closely, touch it, smell it, satisfy themselves that there was nothing sinister hidden in these ordinary medical supplies. Then she brought out the Mercurochrome. The room tensed, old fears not entirely forgotten. But this time Lieutenant Pritchard had a different approach. She had asked Greta, whose medical background made her credible to the other prisoners, to assist with the demonstration. Together they explained the chemical composition of Mercurochrome, its history of use in American medicine, and why its red color, while startling, was simply a result of the compounds used in its manufacture. Max volunteered to demonstrate again, this time applying the antiseptic to a small scratch on her forearm while explaining each step. Then she asked if anyone else would be willing to try it on themselves, to see firsthand that it caused no pain or harm. The room fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to volunteer. Finally, Gisela stood up. Her arm still bore a faint red-orange stain from when the Mercurochrome had been applied to her cut weeks earlier. She had been the first to fear it, and now she would be the first to accept it voluntarily. She walked to the front of the room and held out her hand to Lieutenant Pritchard. Opal applied a small amount of the antiseptic to Gisela's palm, explaining each step through Bruni's translation. The red liquid spread across skin, staining but not burning, marking but not harming. Gisela looked at her palm, then at the watching women, then back at Lieutenant Pritchard. She spoke in careful English that she had been practicing. Not blood, medicine. Thank you. The demonstration marked a turning point, but trust built slowly, one small decision at a time. In the days following the medical education session, more women began accepting treatment for minor ailments they had been hiding. A sprained wrist was finally examined and properly wrapped. A persistent rash received the ointment it needed. A tooth infection was treated before it could become dangerous. Greta became Lieutenant Pritchard's unofficial assistant, helping with basic nursing tasks and translating medical terms that Bruni's vocabulary didn't include. The two women developed a professional rhythm, working side by side in the infirmary with an efficiency that impressed even skeptical Sergeant Ramsey. Greta's knowledge of wound care and her gentle manner with frightened patients made her invaluable. But the real test came when Anna Brecht, a 19-year-old prisoner who had remained deeply suspicious of all American medical care, developed a severe infection in her hand. She had cut herself while working in the camp laundry, and the wound had festered for days before anyone noticed. By the time Greta saw it, red streaks were climbing up Anna's arm, the telltale sign of blood poisoning spreading. Greta brought Anna to the infirmary immediately, her urgency transcending any language barrier. Lieutenant Pritchard took one look at the infection and knew they were facing another crisis. The wound needed to be opened, drained, cleaned thoroughly, and treated with aggressive antiseptic application. Without prompt treatment, the infection could reach Anna's bloodstream and become life-threatening. The problem was that Anna was terrified. She had watched Trudy's illness from a distance, had attended the medical demonstration reluctantly, but had never fully accepted that American medicine could be trusted. Now she sat on the examination table trembling, staring at the bottle of Mercurochrome like it was a weapon aimed at her heart. Max tried reasoning with her through Bruni's translation, explaining the danger of untreated blood poisoning, describing what would happen if the infection continued to spread. But Anna kept shaking her head, pulling her infected hand against her chest protectively. She would rather take her chances with the infection than submit to treatment she didn't understand. Gisela, who had been waiting nearby for a routine check on her healed cut, heard the commotion and came to investigate. She saw Anna's fear and recognized it immediately as the same terror she herself had felt weeks earlier. She asked Bruni what was happening, listened to the explanation, then made a decision. She sat down beside Anna on the examination table and began speaking to her in rapid German, her voice firm but compassionate. Bruni translated for the American nurses. Gisela was telling Anna about her own experience, about her fear of the red bottle, about how that fear had been based on misunderstanding rather than reality. She showed Anna her arm, where the cut had healed cleanly with no scarring, no damage, nothing but healthy skin where the Mercurochrome had been applied. Anna listened, but remained unconvinced. Words were not enough to overcome weeks of propaganda and deeply ingrained fear. Gisela understood that Anna needed more than explanations. She needed to see someone she trusted accept the treatment first, someone who shared her background and her fears. So Gisela made an offer that surprised everyone in the infirmary. She asked Lieutenant Pritchard to make a small cut on her own arm and treat it with Mercurochrome while Anna watched. Lieutenant Pritchard started to object. There was no medical reason to cut healthy skin, and the request seemed excessive. But Max intervened, recognizing the deeper significance of what Gisela was proposing. This wasn't about medicine anymore. It was about trust, about one prisoner showing another that accepting help from former enemies wasn't betrayal, but survival. Opal reluctantly agreed, making the smallest possible incision on Gisela's forearm, just deep enough to require antiseptic treatment. Gisela didn't flinch, keeping her eyes on Anna's face the entire time. When Lieutenant Pritchard applied the Mercurochrome, the familiar red stain spreading across skin, Gisela spoke quietly to Anna in German. Bruni translated. She was saying that fear was natural, that everything they had been taught made this seem dangerous, but that sometimes the bravest thing was to let go of fear and accept help. Anna watched the red medicine dry on Gisela's arm, saw that her friend showed no signs of pain or distress, and finally, reluctantly, extended her infected hand. The treatment was painful, not because of the mercurochrome, but because the infection had to be drained and the wound cleaned thoroughly. Anna gritted her teeth and gripped Gisella's uninjured hand while Lieutenant Pritchard worked. When the mercurochrome was finally applied, covering the cleaned wound in that alarming crimson stain, Anna stared at it with a mixture of fear and fascination. Within 2 days, the infection began to recede. The red streaks faded, the swelling decreased, and Anna's fever broke. She returned to the infirmary for daily wound care, and each time she accepted the mercurochrome treatment with a little less hesitation. By the end of the week, she was asking questions about how the medicine worked, wanting to understand the science behind the healing. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Other prisoners saw Anna's infected hand healing cleanly, saw her returning from the infirmary without trauma or harm, and their own resistance began to crumble. The infirmary became busier as women finally sought treatment for conditions they had been hiding. Max and Lieutenant Pritchard found themselves treating everything from minor cuts to chronic conditions that had gone untreated for months. Greta worked alongside them, her skills and knowledge growing with each patient. The infirmary, which had been a place of fear and suspicion, gradually became something different, a place of healing and, tentatively, of trust. But the real change went deeper than medical care. The German prisoners were beginning to see their American captors as something other than enemies. They were seeing them as people who could show kindness, who could heal rather than harm, who could be trusted with vulnerability. January 1945 brought a bitter cold snap to Mississippi and devastating news from Europe. The first letters from Germany began arriving at Camp Shelby, filtered through Red Cross channels and military censors. Many prisoners had been writing home for months without response, uncertain if their families had received the letters or even if their families still existed. Gisela received word that her apartment building in Berlin had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid. Her mother and younger sister had survived but were living in a refugee shelter with inadequate food and heating. Her father, the postal worker who had quietly doubted the Reich, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch home guard, and no one had heard from him in weeks. She read the letter in the barracks, her hands shaking. Everything she had known was gone. The city of her childhood existed only in ruins. Her family was scattered and suffering, and here she sat, warm and fed and safe in enemy captivity, while they struggled to survive in the homeland she had supposedly been defending. Bruni's news was even worse. Her entire family had been killed when a V-2 rocket, one of Germany's own weapons, had malfunctioned during launch and crashed into their neighborhood in Bonn. The letter from a surviving neighbor was brief and matter-of-fact, describing deaths that had been quick and probably painless, as if that detail could somehow soften the absolute devastation of losing everyone she loved. She didn't cry when she read it. She simply folded the letter carefully, placed it in her footlocker, and walked out to the compound yard. She stood in the cold January rain for nearly an hour before Max found her and gently led her back inside. Only then, wrapped in a blanket, in the infirmary while Max made tea, did Bruni finally break down. Not everyone received bad news. Trudy learned that her sister had made it safely to Switzerland with her children, escaping the chaos in Frankfurt. Anna Breck discovered that her parents were alive and working on a farm in Bavaria, far from the devastated cities. But even good news carried shadows. Germany was losing the war, and everyone knew it now. The letters brought something else, too, something the women hadn't expected. Many included questions about their treatment in American captivity, anxious inquiries from family members who had heard propaganda about enemy brutality. Gisela's mother asked if she was being forced to work without pay, if she had enough food, if the Americans were cruel. Gisela found herself writing a response that felt almost surreal. She described the medical care she had received, the food that was plain but adequate, The work assignments that were reasonable. She mentioned Lieutenant Pritchard and Corporal Dubois, the demonstration with the Mercurochrome, the gradual realization that Americans were not the monsters she had been taught to expect. By February 1945, the bottle of Mercurochrome had taken on significance far beyond its medical purpose. It sat on the infirmary shelf like a small monument to transformation, its crimson contents representing the journey from fear to understanding that the German women had experienced. New prisoners arriving at the compound heard the story of the red bottle as part of their orientation, told by the women who had lived through the misunderstanding. Greta had begun keeping informal notes about the antiseptic's effectiveness, tracking how wounds healed and infections resolved. Her documentation was meticulous, reflecting both her medical training and her growing confidence in American medical practices. She showed her records to Lieutenant Pritchard, who was impressed by the thoroughness and suggested Greta might consider formal nursing education after the war. The idea stunned Greta. After the war felt like an impossibly distant concept, and the notion that she might have opportunities for education and career advancement seemed like fantasy. But Lieutenant Pritchard was serious. She had been corresponding with nursing schools in Arkansas and Louisiana, asking about their policies regarding foreign students and former enemy nationals. Several had expressed tentative interest. Max had started teaching informal English classes in the evenings, and the Mercurochrome bottle often featured in lessons about American medical terminology. The women learned words like antiseptic, disinfectant, infection, and healing. They practiced pronunciation and memorized phrases that might be useful if they ever needed medical care outside the camp. But the lessons went beyond vocabulary. Max used the story of the red bottle to teach about cultural differences and the dangers of assumptions. She talked about how the same object could mean completely different things to different people, how fear could transform something harmless into something terrifying, how communication and education could bridge even the widest gaps of misunderstanding. Gisela had become something of a camp legend. Her transformation from the terrified young woman who had refused treatment to someone who now helped translate during medical procedures made her a symbol of what was possible. She found herself counseling newly arrived prisoners, explaining that their fears were understandable but unnecessary, that the Americans could be trusted with their health and safety. The red bottle also became a teaching tool for the American staff. Sergeant Ramsey used the story during orientation for new guards, emphasizing the importance of patience and clear communication when dealing with prisoners. Private Walsh incorporated it into her reports about effective camp management. Even skeptical officers who visited from other facilities heard about the Mercurochrome incident and its resolution. Dr. Feldman, the civilian physician, was so intrigued by the psychological aspects of the misunderstanding that he wrote a paper about it for a medical journal. He described how cultural context shaped perception, how wartime propaganda created filters through which prisoners interpreted every interaction, and how simple demonstration could overcome deeply ingrained fear. The paper would eventually be published after the war, contributing to discussions about prisoner psychology and effective medical care in detention facilities. But for the women at Camp Shelby, the red bottle meant something more personal. It represented the moment when they began to question everything they had been taught about their enemies. It marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape their entire understanding of the world and their place in it. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that seemed both inevitable and shocking. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang across America, while in Camp Shelby, the German women prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the official announcement from Sergeant Ramsey. Victory in Europe Day meant celebration for their captors, but profound uncertainty for the prisoners themselves. The women's reactions varied dramatically. Some wept with relief that the killing had finally stopped. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the reality of absolute defeat. A few, like Trudy, felt a strange mixture of emotions, grief for their destroyed homeland, combined with complicated gratitude that they had survived to see this day. Lieutenant Pritchard watched from the doorway, trying to imagine what it must feel like to receive news of your country's total defeat while imprisoned thousands of miles from home. She had prepared medical supplies in case anyone needed sedation or treatment for shock, but the women remained remarkably composed. They had been preparing for this moment for months, reading between the lines of censored letters and listening to camp rumors about Allied advances. The immediate question on everyone's mind was, what would happen next? Repatriation procedures would begin, but when and how remained unclear. Germany was occupied, divided into zones controlled by different Allied powers. Many cities existed only as rubble. The infrastructure for processing and transporting millions of displaced persons and prisoners of war was still being established. Greta found herself thinking about Hamburg, wondering what remained of the city where she had trained as a medical assistant. The letters from her aunt had described destruction so complete that entire neighborhoods no longer existed. What would she return to? Who would she be in a Germany that had been utterly transformed by defeat? Bruni faced an even starker reality. With her entire family dead, she had no home to return to in Bonn. She would be just another displaced person in a country full of them, competing for scarce resources and trying to build a life from nothing. The thought terrified her more than captivity ever had. Gisella's letters from her mother had become increasingly desperate. Food was scarce, medical care nearly non-existent, and the Soviet occupation of Berlin had brought new fears and dangers. Her mother had written, carefully coded to pass censorship, that conditions were deteriorating and that Gisela might want to delay her return as long as possible. Anna Brecht was one of the few who genuinely wanted to go home. Her parents needed her help on the farm in Bavaria, and she felt guilty for every day she remained in American captivity while they struggled. She had already written to request immediate repatriation as soon as procedures were established. In the days following the surrender announcement, Lieutenant Pritchard held individual meetings with each prisoner to assess their health status and discuss repatriation plans. She was surprised by how many women expressed reluctance about returning immediately. They cited practical concerns about destroyed cities and missing family members. But Opal sensed something deeper. These women had found something in captivity that many of them hadn't expected to find: stability, safety, and purpose. The infirmary had become a strange haven during the uncertain transition period. Women came for minor complaints that probably didn't require medical attention, just seeking the comfort of familiar routine. The formal repatriation announcement came on June 1, 1945. All German prisoners of war would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to their homes. Transportation would be arranged within 6 to 8 weeks. The women should prepare to leave Camp Shelby by mid-July. That evening, the barracks filled with intense discussions about what returning to Germany would actually mean. Trudy argued that they had a duty to help rebuild their country, that running away from the devastation would be cowardly. Anna Brecht agreed, insisting that families needed their daughters and sisters, that Germany needed every able-bodied person willing to work. But Greta voiced what others were thinking, but afraid to say. What if they didn't want to go back? What if the Germany they returned to was so different from the country they had left that they would be strangers there? What if they had learned things in American captivity that made them fundamentally incompatible with whatever new society was emerging from the ruins? Bruni was blunt. She had nothing to return to. Her family was dead, her city destroyed, and her skills as a translator would be worthless in an occupied country where everyone would need to learn the languages of their conquerors anyway. Why return to nothing when she might build something here? The conversation turned to practicalities. Could they even stay if they wanted to? What legal status would they have? How would they support themselves? Where would they live? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them. Gisela had been thinking about this constantly since receiving her mother's last letter. The message had been clear, even through the careful wording required to pass censorship. Berlin was dangerous, especially for young women. Her mother wanted her to stay away until conditions improved. But how long would that take? Months? Years? A lifetime? She thought about what she had learned at Camp Shelby, not just English and medical terminology from Max's classes, but deeper lessons about different ways of organizing society, treating people with dignity, and building trust across enemy lines. She thought about Lieutenant Pritchard's suggestion that Greta pursue nursing education and wondered if similar opportunities might exist for others. Most of all, she thought about the red bottle. That small container of Mercurochrome represented everything she had discovered about the gap between propaganda and reality. She had been taught that Americans were cruel, barbaric, interested only in domination and destruction. Instead, she had found people who healed wounds, showed patience with frightened prisoners, and created opportunities for redemption and growth. 3 days after the repatriation announcement, Gisela asked Bruni to help her write a letter to Sergeant Ramsey. The request was unusual, probably unprecedented, but she had to ask. She wanted to know if there was any possibility of remaining in the United States rather than accepting immediate repatriation. Bruni stared at her. "Are you serious? This is what you want?" Gisela nodded. She explained her reasoning, her family situation, her belief that she could contribute more by staying and eventually helping from a position of stability rather than returning to chaos and scarcity. Gisela's letter triggered a bureaucratic cascade that reached all the way to Washington. The War Department had procedures for prisoner repatriation, but no clear policy regarding prisoners who requested to remain in the United States. Her case was unusual enough that it required consultation with the State Department, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and legal advisors specializing in international law. While officials debated her request, other women came forward with similar petitions. Bruni submitted paperwork citing her lack of family and the destruction of her home city. Greta applied based on her desire to continue medical education and her sponsorship offer from Lieutenant Pritchard's family in Arkansas. Within 2 weeks, 11 of the 42 prisoners had formally requested permission to remain. The local community's reaction was mixed. Some newspapers ran editorials questioning why Nazi prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still fighting in the Pacific. Others, particularly church groups that had interacted with the women through Red Cross programs, wrote letters of support. The debate reached beyond Mississippi, becoming a national conversation about forgiveness, redemption, and America's role in the post-war world. Sergeant Ramsey found himself managing a media circus he had never anticipated. Reporters from newspapers in Jackson, New Orleans, and even New York requested interviews with the German women who wanted to stay. He denied most requests, but allowed one carefully supervised press conference where Gisela, speaking in heavily accented but clear English, explained her reasoning. She talked about the red bottle, about her initial terror and gradual understanding, about what that experience had taught her about the dangers of propaganda and the possibilities of human connection across enemy lines. Her sincerity impressed even skeptical journalists, and several newspapers ran sympathetic stories about the transformations happening at Camp Shelby. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, the wife of a Mississippi congressman, had been volunteering with the Red Cross program at the camp. She had befriended several of the German women and was moved by their stories. She convinced her husband to introduce legislation creating a special immigration category for former enemy prisoners who could demonstrate genuine transformation and secure American sponsors. The legislation faced opposition but eventually passed with modifications. It allowed up to 25 former German prisoners from Camp Shelby to apply for displaced person status and eventual permanent residency, provided they could prove they had renounced Nazi ideology secure employment and housing, and find American citizens willing to sponsor them. 9 women ultimately chose to stay. Gisela received sponsorship from a translator service in Atlanta. Greta enrolled in nursing school in Little Rock with Lieutenant Pritchard's family as her sponsors. Bruni found work teaching German at a small college in Tennessee. The others secured positions ranging from domestic service to factory work, each finding Americans willing to give them a second chance. The 33 women who chose repatriation left Camp Shelby in late July. The departure was emotional, with tears and embraces between those staying and those leaving. They had arrived as enemies, but had become something like family through shared experience. 28 years after that November day, when Gisela Hartmann first saw the red bottle and thought it was blood, she stood in the arrivals hall at Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, waiting for a special visitor. Greta Vogel-Weber was arriving from Hamburg, where she now served as director of nursing at a major hospital. They had maintained correspondence over the decades, but hadn't seen each other in person since 1953. Gisela had built a successful life in America. She had become a naturalized citizen in 1951, married an engineer named Robert Chen in 1954, and raised 3 children who had never known war or displacement. Her work as a translator had evolved into a career teaching German language and culture at Georgia State University. She had published a memoir about her experiences at Camp Shelby, focusing on the red bottle incident as a metaphor for overcoming fear through understanding. Greta's path had been different, but equally remarkable. She had returned to Germany in 1958 after completing her nursing education, determined to contribute to her homeland, reconstruction. She had worked in hospitals devastated by war, helped train a new generation of German nurses, and become an advocate for international medical cooperation. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to healing and education. When they finally embraced in the airport, both women were crying. They spoke in rapid German, then English, then German again, languages flowing together as naturally as their shared memories. They had so much to tell each other, so many years to catch up on. Over dinner that evening, they talked about the other women from Camp Shelby. Bruni had become a professor emeritus, having taught German literature for 30 years. Trudy, who had returned to Germany, had helped establish one of the first German-American friendship societies in Frankfurt. Annebrecht had married an American soldier and was living in Oregon with 6 grandchildren. But they kept returning to the red bottle, that small container of Mercurochrome that had meant so much. Gisela told Greta that she kept one in her medicine cabinet, even though Americans rarely used it anymore. Every time she saw it, she remembered the terrified 23-year-old who had thought it was blood, who had been so certain that Americans were monsters. Greta laughed and admitted she did the same thing. In Hamburg, Mercurochrome was considered old-fashioned, replaced by newer antiseptics, but she kept a bottle in her office as a reminder. Patients sometimes asked about it, and she would tell them the story of how a simple misunderstanding had changed her life. They talked about Lieutenant Pritchard, who had passed away in 1968, and Max Dubois, who still sent Christmas cards from Louisiana. They discussed Sergeant Ramsey, who had written a book about his experiences managing the women's compound. They remembered the cold Mississippi winters and the gradual thawing of fear into trust. As the evening ended, Gisela gave Greta a gift, a small bottle of Mercurochrome, vintage 1944, that she had preserved all these years. "It will outlast both of us," she said, a reminder that healing is possible.